Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from America's past. Now, let's step back in time. Asterisk, the year was 1903, and the little town of Millbrook, tucked away in the green hills of New York State, lived at the slow and steady rhythm of a place that had never quite caught up with the world outside. The railroad had passed through 2 decades before, bringing visitors and news from Albany and New York City. But the people of Millbrook clung to their ways, their farms, and their old houses with stubborn pride. Wooden fences still lined the narrow dirt roads. The church bell rang on Sundays with the same solemn toll it had rung since the Civil War, and in the center of the town stood the Hartwell home, a grand 2-story house of weathered white clapboard, its windows watching the world like tired, unblinking eyes. The Hartwell family had lived there for nearly 60 years. The house was built by Jonathan Hartwell, who came home broken, but alive from the war in 1865. He raised it for his wife and the children they hoped to have. And though Jonathan passed in 1889, the house still carried the weight of his name. By 1903, the Hartwell household was kept by his widow, Margaret, now gray-haired and thin, her face carved with the lines of both joy and sorrow. Her eldest son, Charles, remained there too, a quiet man of 35 who helped manage the land and kept the accounts for neighboring farms. And there was young Clara, only 19, the last of Margaret's children still at home, with a laugh that seemed too bright for the dim old house. The spring of that year brought with it an idea. Margaret decided, after some persuasion from Clara, that it was time for the family to have their portrait taken. Families all over Millbrook had theirs posed photographs in stiff collars and pressed dresses, framed and displayed in parlors. The Hartwells had none. Jonathan had never thought much of photographs, and though there were a few fading tintypes from the 1870s, they were scratched, ghostly things, hardly recognizable anymore. Clara had pressed the issue, saying, "Mama, one day we'll want to look back and remember how we were in this year. It's proper to have one." So it was agreed. Margaret sent word to Henry Blackwood, a photographer who had opened a small studio in Poughkeepsie. He was known for traveling to towns with his heavy equipment, setting up in parlors, barns, and even fields if need be. His pictures were always praised for their clarity, and his manner was kind, though somewhat reserved. He arrived in Millbrook on a warm May morning, the air smelling of cut grass and apple blossoms, carrying his camera, glass plates, and the dark box where he prepared them. The Hartwells welcomed him with courtesy. Clara brewed tea, Margaret fussed over the dust in the parlor, and Charles carried in the photographer's equipment. Blackwood set about arranging the space. He chose the wide front room where the light streamed through tall windows, pulling back heavy curtains to let in the soft spring sun. The camera, a hulking thing of polished wood and brass fittings, was placed on its tripod in the corner. The family was instructed to sit very still when the moment came, to hold their expressions without a twitch, for even the smallest movement would blur the plate dot as the afternoon light settled. They prepared themselves. Margaret smoothed her hair, Clara tied a ribbon around her neck, and Charles donned his best coat. Blackwood adjusted the backdrop, an embroidered cloth borrowed from his studio, and carefully guided each family member into position. Margaret sat in the center, stiff but dignified. Clara stood to her left, her youthful brightness framed against her mother's weariness. Charles sat to the right, hands folded, his gaze fixed solemnly ahead. Blackwood looked through the lens, studied the grouping, and not a dot just as the photograph was about to be taken. Clara whispered something, a small jest under her breath, and a smile broke across her face. Margaret scolded softly, "Now hold still, child." But the smile lingered, faint, stubborn, impossible to suppress. Blackwood caught it, and with a quiet click, the moment was sealed on glass. That image, developed later in the dim red glow of the dark room, would show them as they were: a mother aged and dignified, a son solemn and dutiful, and a daughter with the trace of a smile cheerful, almost mischievous. Yet those who saw the photograph in the years to come would remark on something else. Not the smile, not the family's posture, but the faint suggestion of another presence. Behind them, in the blurred shadows of the parlor, some swore they could see the outline of a figure, a shape too defined to be chance, too human to be ignored. Blackwood himself noticed it when he prepared the print. He stared long at the plate, then at the paper image. At first, he thought it a trick of the curtains, a fold of fabric catching the light. But the longer he looked, the more it unsettled him. It seemed to be a man, standing just inside the doorway to the hall, half obscured, his face indistinct, but his posture rigid, as if watching. Blackwood said nothing to the Hartwells when he delivered the photograph the next week. He handed it over with his usual polite smile, accepted his payment, and left Millbrook with an unease he could not quite name. The Hartwells themselves noticed it soon enough. Clara was the first. She had been dusting the parlor when she paused to study the framed photograph on the mantel. She leaned closer, squinting, her hand tightening on the cloth she held. There, just behind Charles, just at the edge of the curtain, it was clear as day. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing as if waiting. She gasped, calling for her mother. Margaret came, and together they stared. Margaret's face paled, her lips trembling. "That is?" "It cannot be," she whispered. Charles, when he saw it, only frowned, his jaw tightening. He refused to say what it looked like to him, but in her heart, Margaret knew. It looked like Jonathan, her husband, gone 14 years, whose portrait had never been properly made, who had built this house with his own hands. The resemblance was not exact, but it was there, the stance, the outline of the shoulders, the shape of the head. Clara, frightened yet fascinated, asked, "Mama, do you think he's watching us?" Margaret shushed her, though her own eyes remained fixed on the image, unwilling to look away. Word spread quietly. Visitors who saw the photograph often remarked on the strange figure in the background. Some said it was surely a trick of the light, nothing more than a shadow. Others, with a hushed tone, whispered that the Hartwell house had always felt unsettled. They remembered odd things, lamps flickering, footsteps in empty rooms, doors that seemed to close by themselves. Old houses creaked, yes, but the Hartwell home, they said, had a weight to it, as though the past lingered too strongly. Clara tried to laugh it off at first, saying it was just an accident of the photograph, nothing more. Yet she began to feel uneasy in the house after nightfall. She would catch herself glancing at the dark hallway when she passed by, half expecting to see someone standing there. Charles grew more silent, more withdrawn, his eyes lingering on the photograph, as though he saw in it something he dared not speak aloud. Margaret prayed more often, her hands trembling over her worn Bible. The photograph remained on the mantel, but it was no longer a simple family portrait. It was a reminder, a presence, a whisper from the past that seemed to stretch its hand into the present. And as the summer of 1903 deepened, the Hartwells would find that what had been caught in that picture was not merely an image, but the beginning of something that would haunt them in ways they could not yet imagine. Through the long summer of 1903, the Hartwell house seemed to carry a weight heavier than the warm air pressing down on Millbrook. The photograph sat in its frame above the mantel, and though none of them wished to admit it, each member of the family felt its quiet pull. Visitors noticed it immediately upon entering the parlor, and though polite company rarely spoke of it directly, their eyes would drift again and again to the background of the picture. A few neighbors, less restrained, said outright what everyone else tiptoed around. "It looks like a man standing there, like he's watching." Margaret Hartwell tried to hold to her dignity. She told herself that it was no more than a trick of the camera, shadows caught where none should be. She had seen photographs before where the light played strange tricks, creating shapes where there were none. Yet she could not help but return to it again and again, staring at that blurred figure until her eyes burned. And each time, her heart whispered the same word. Jonathan Dot. She did not speak the name aloud. Not in front of Clara, whose curiosity could so easily turn into dread. Not in front of Charles, whose stiff silence since the photograph had grown into a wall between him and the rest of the family. But in the long evenings, when the cicadas whined outside and the house sank into shadow, she found herself whispering it softly into her folded hands. "Jonathan, are you here?" Clara tried to busy herself. She spent more time in the garden, tending the roses that her father had planted years ago. She gathered herbs from the edges of the yard and brought them in to dry. She visited with her friend Lydia, whose laughter was bright enough to drive away the unease for a time. Yet even Clara, cheerful Clara with her stubborn smile, could not escape the feeling that the house was no longer the same. Dot at night, she would wake in her bed and think she heard footsteps on the landing outside her door. Slow, deliberate steps, not the creak of settling wood. Once she called out, "Mama," but no answer came, and when she opened her door, the hallway stretched empty and dark, a photograph in the parlor just barely visible in the moonlight. She hurried back to bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin, her heart thudding like a hammer. Charles changed more than anyone. Always a quiet man, he became almost sullen. He lingered in the parlor long after the others had gone to bed, sitting in the chair across from the mantel, staring at the photograph as if it were a mirror showing him something he could not quite name. His account books went neglected. Neighbors noticed his absence from the market. When asked, Margaret could only say, "He has much on his mind," though she herself did not understand what it was. One evening in late June, Clara came down the stairs to find her brother standing before the photograph with a lamp held close. His face was pale, his eyes wide, fixed on the shadowy figure behind him. She whispered his name, "Charles?" and he started violently, nearly dropping the lamp. He turned on her, his voice harsh. "Go back to bed, Clara. This is no business of yours." Clara's eyes filled with tears at the sharpness of his tone, but she obeyed. Yet she did not forget the look on his face, a look of both fear and recognition, as though he knew more about the figure than he was willing to speak. July brought thunderstorms, heavy rains pounding the old roof and filling the gutters until they overflowed. The house shuddered with each crash of thunder, and more than once Margaret thought she heard a second sound beneath it, a muffled slam, as though a door deep within the house were closing. She told herself it was the storm, nothing more, but still she prayed harder than before. It was during one of these nights, when the storm raged fiercest, that Clara woke again to footsteps in the hall. This time they were louder, nearer. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. The knob of her door rattled gently, then turned. The door opened just a crack, enough for her to see the dark outline of a figure standing there. She froze, unable to cry out. Then the door closed again, the latch clicking softly, and the footsteps retreated down the hall. The next morning she told her mother. Margaret listened, her face pale, her hands trembling as she poured tea. "Perhaps it was Charles," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Clara shook her head. "It wasn't Charles. I know his step." This was different, slower, heavier. Margaret set down the teapot and gripped her daughter's hands. "Clara, we must not let our imaginations run away with us. Old houses play tricks, that is all. But in her heart she did not believe it. She had seen the photograph. She had heard the sounds. And she too had felt the cold weight of being watched. By August, whispers spread through Millbrook. Servants spoke of the Hartwell house in hushed tones, refusing to stay after dark. Children dared each other to run up to the porch and knock, but none lingered long. The story of the photograph of the figure in the background circulated through the town like smoke, winding its way into every parlor and shop. Some said it was a ghost. Some said it was proof that Jonathan Hartwell still guarded his home. Others shook their heads and said it was nonsense. Though they spoke with nervous eyes, Margaret bore the whispers with a strained dignity. She continued her routines, attending church, writing letters, keeping the house as best she could. But she felt the weight of judgment pressing in. She could not banish the photograph, for it was a part of her now, a tether to the man she had lost. To remove it would be to admit fear. So it stayed, and with it, the shadow stayed too. Then came the night of the lantern. It was early September, and the air had begun to cool. Clara, restless, had taken to sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies dance over the fields. On this night she saw, through the window, the glow of a lantern moving inside the house. She frowned. Her mother had gone to bed, and Charles was supposed to be at the barn. Yet the light moved steadily through the hallway, pausing near the parlor door. Curiosity pulled at her, stronger than fear. She stepped inside, her shoes silent on the rug. The lantern glow flickered ahead, just beyond the corner. She followed, her breath shallow. As she neared the parlor, the light suddenly vanished, leaving only darkness. She stepped forward quickly, heart pounding, and froze. The photograph on the mantel glowed faintly in the dark, as though lit from within. And standing before it, outlined in the pale light, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. Clara gasped, and in that instant the lantern flared again, revealing nothing but the empty room. The figure was gone. She stumbled backward, nearly, falling, then fled up the stairs, her cries waking her mother. Margaret found her trembling in bed, unable to speak for several minutes. When at last she could, Clara swore she had seen him, not a shadow, not a trick, but a man standing there. Margaret held her close, whispering prayers. Yet her own eyes filled with tears, for in her heart she knew Clara spoke the truth. Something lingered in that house, bound to them through the photograph, through memory, through loss. Something that would not let go. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The Hartwell home stood with its windows watching the road, and those who passed. I swore they sometimes saw a face at the upstairs window, though the family was nowhere near. Inside, silence pressed on the rooms, broken only by the creak of footsteps that belonged to no living man. And through it all, the photograph remained, Margaret, Charles, and Clara frozen in their solemn poses, Clara's smile faint and brave, while behind them, blurred but unmistakable, a presence waited, a hidden face within. Autumn came to Millbrook with the sound of dry leaves scraping across the dirt roads, and the scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. The Hartwell home stood tall against the chill winds, its white clapboard dulled by age, its windows like tired eyes watching the season change. Yet inside, the house did not warm with the glow of hearth fires or laughter. It grew quieter, darker, a place of whispers and unease. The photograph on the mantel remained. None of them dared remove it. Margaret had once reached for the frame, thinking to put it away in a drawer, but as her hands closed around it, a coldness seeped into her fingers, biting and unnatural, until she recoiled with a gasp. Clara pleaded, "Mama, let's take it down, please." But Margaret shook her head. "It is ours. We cannot hide from it." And so it stayed, the silent witness in their parlor. Charles grew worse with each passing week. He scarcely left the house, his once tidy appearance slipping into neglect. He spent long hours in the parlor, staring at the photograph, muttering under his breath words Margaret could not hear. Clara, creeping down the stairs one night, caught fragments. "He's here, I see you, I'll not leave," and fled back to her bed, trembling. When she asked him the next morning what he had been saying, he looked at her with eyes so weary and hollow she hardly recognized her brother. "Clara," he said softly, "there are things you should not ask." Margaret worried for him, prayed for him, but she herself was no longer certain of her footing. She felt the house pressing in on her, the weight of memories she had long tried to set aside. Each creak of the stair, each slam of a distant door, stirred her heart with dread. She began to dream again of Jonathan, as she had in the first years after his death. Dreams of him walking through the house, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his face hidden in shadow. In the dreams he never spoke, only stood watching her, until she woke with tears on her cheeks and the feeling of someone still standing near the bed. Clara, once the brightest soul in the house, found her laughter fading. Her friends noticed it when she visited them. Lydia asked, "Clara, are you unwell? You've gone pale." Clara only smiled faintly and shook her head. How could she explain the nights she lay awake, listening to the soft turn of her doorknob? How could she describe the way her father's old rocking chair sometimes moved gently by itself, though no one sat in it? She feared they would think her mad, and yet within her heart she knew she was not. One evening in October, a church bell rang long after sunset, an unusual hour. Margaret, Charles, and Clara, sitting in silence by the hearth, startled at the sound. It was the toll used for a death. The next day, news spread. Old Mrs. Turner, a neighbor, had passed suddenly in her sleep. At the funeral, whispers followed. "Margaret, did you hear?" She said the night before she died, she dreamt of Jonathan Hartwell standing in her parlor. Said he looked just as he did when alive, but pale as moonlight. Margaret's hands shook as she straightened her veil. She could not meet their eyes. When they returned home that evening, the house was colder than usual. The hearth fire sputtered, though wood still burned. Clara excused herself early and went upstairs. Margaret and Charles lingered in the parlor. Margaret tried to speak of ordinary things, the harvest, the neighbors, but Charles's gaze never left the photograph. At last he whispered, "Mother, do you believe he is truly here?" Margaret froze, her teacup halfway to her lips. She lowered it slowly and said, "I do not know what to believe." Charles's eyes gleamed in the lamplight, fevered, desperate. "I see him, Mother, not only in the photograph. I see him at the stairs, at the window. He watches me." His voice broke, and he gripped the arm of his chair until his knuckles whitened. "He wants something." Margaret reached for his hand, but he pulled away, rising abruptly and leaving the room. She sat alone, staring at the photograph, her heart aching. She wanted to believe it was only grief, only shadows, only the tricks of a tired mind. But in the stillness, she thought she heard the faint sound of boots on the stair, deliberate and slow. She closed her eyes and prayed until sleep took her where she sat. The first frost came in November. The Hartwells awoke to windows rimmed in. White, the fields silver with cold. Clara, standing at her window, saw something that made her heart seize. In the yard below, footprints pressed into the frost-heavy prints of boots leading from the barn to the porch. She dressed quickly, ran downstairs, and burst out the front door, calling for Charles. But the yard was empty. The prints ended at the porch steps, and there was no sign of anyone who could have made them. She showed her mother. Margaret stared at the tracks, her lips pressed tight. "Do not tell your brother," she said at last. But Charles already knew. He came from the barn not long after, his face pale, and said simply, "He's walking again." That night, Clara dreamed of her father. He stood at the foot of her bed, his face shadowed, his broad frame blocking the faint moonlight from the window. She could not move, could not speak. He raised his hand, and she saw in it the photograph from the mantel. Then he placed it at her feet and whispered her name, not in anger, not in love, but with a hollow emptiness that made her shiver. She woke with a scream, and Margaret came rushing in, holding her tightly until her sobs quieted. Charles grew restless. He began leaving the house at odd hours, wandering the fields, the woods, the old family cemetery beyond the orchard. Margaret followed once, calling after him, but he walked as though in a trance, not hearing her. When he returned, he was covered in dirt, his hands raw and scraped. "I had to look," he muttered. She asked what he meant, but he would not answer. As Thanksgiving neared, the family should have been preparing for guests, for warmth and food and fellowship. But no one came to the Hartwell house that year. Rumors had grown too strong, fear too deep. Even Lydia's family forbade her from visiting Clara, saying it was not proper to keep company in a house so troubled. Clara felt the sting of isolation keenly, her cheer dimming into a quiet sorrow. On the night of November 24th, the eve of the holiday, something happened that none of them would ever forget. The three of them sat together in the parlor, the wind howling outside, rattling the shutters. The photograph gleamed in the lamplight, and for a long while they sat in silence, each lost in thought. Then, slowly, the frame began to tilt forward. It did not fall at once, but leaned, as if an unseen hand pushed it. Then it crashed face first onto the hearth, the glass shattering with a sharp crack. Clara screamed. Margaret clutched her rosary, murmuring prayers. Charles rushed forward, his hands trembling as he picked up the photograph. The glass was broken, but the image beneath was intact. Yet as they looked, they saw that the shadowed figure in the background had grown clearer. What had once been a blurred outline was now more distinct, the shape of a face just visible, eyes dark and fixed. Margaret whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Clara buried her face in her hands. But Charles only stared, his breath quickening, his expression both terrified and strangely exultant. "It's him," he said. "It's Father. He's trying to come through." That night, Margaret locked the photograph away in a drawer, unable to bear its presence. But Charles found it before dawn, returning it to the mantel, saying, "It belongs here. He belongs here." And from that moment, a rift grew between them. Margaret begged him to let it rest, to seek help from the pastor. But Charles refused. "You do not understand," he told her. "He is not gone. He will not be gone." December came, and with its snow that blanketed the town, muffling the world in silence. The Hartwell house stood stark against the white, smoke trailing thin from its chimney. But inside, unrest grew deeper. Clara fell ill with a fever, confined to her bed, her cheeks flushed and her body weak. Margaret tended her day and night, praying the illness would pass. In her fevered dreams, Clara whispered of her father standing at her bedside, of his cold hand touching her hair. Charles spent more and more time in the cellar, digging through old trunks, searching for things Margaret did not wish to see. She found him one day clutching Jonathan's old uniform coat, his eyes glazed with something beyond grief. "He wants it," Charles said softly. "He wants to be whole again." Margaret tried to take it from him, but he clung to it like a child. Christmas passed without celebration. No carols, no feast, only the silence of a house that felt less like a home and more like a tomb. On New Year's Eve, Clara, still weak but awake, asked her mother, "Do you think he'll ever leave us, Mama?" Margaret, stroking her daughter's hair, whispered, I pray he will. But in her heart, she feared the truth, that Jonathan Hartwell had never truly left at all. And as the bells rang in the new year of 1904, the Hartwell family sat in their house, bound together not by joy, but by the shadow of a presence that smiled, faintly from the photograph, waiting for the moment to step fully from the past into the present. The new year of 1904 began with bitter cold, the kind that froze water in the pails and cracked the boards of the barn. Snow lay deep along the roads of Millbrook, cutting the town into silence, and the Hartwell house stood shuttered against the wind. Yet the silence inside the house was heavier still, filled with a dread that no fire could warm. Margaret, weary from months of sleepless nights, carried on with the stubborn strength of a woman who had weathered grief before. She rose early, tended the hearth, and cared for Clara, who was still recovering from her illness. But her face was pale, her frame thinner, as though the life within her drained day by day. Clara, though stronger now, was not the same girl she had been before the summer. The brightness in her laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She did not sit long in the parlor anymore, not with the photograph on the mantel. She preferred the kitchen or her mother's company, places where the shadows did not seem to reach so strongly. Yet at night she still heard the slow steps in the hall, still felt the cool breath of something unseen upon her cheek. Charles was the one most changed. He scarcely spoke, except in mutters no one could fully hear. His once gentle nature had hardened into something sharper, restless. He spent hours with the photograph, sometimes sitting before it in the dark, with no lamp lit, as if trying to let his eyes adjust to the figure within. Margaret caught him once reaching out, touching the image with his fingers as though stroking the blurred shape of their father's shoulder. When she asked what he was doing, he turned on her with eyes wild and said, "He's almost here. Can you not feel it? He's coming back." Margaret, terrified by the fever in his voice, wrote a letter to the pastor, Reverend Collins, begging him to visit. The Reverend arrived on a cold January afternoon, his breath clouding in the frosty air, his Bible tucked under his arm. He had heard the whispers about the Hartwell house, but he had not believed them until he stepped through the door. The air inside was heavy, as though pressing down upon his chest. The moment his eyes fell on the photograph, he stopped short. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said gravely, "I think this should not remain here." Margaret clasped her hands together, relief and fear warring in her heart. "I have tried," she whispered. "I have tried to put it away. But Charles, he will not let it be." The Reverend spoke with Charles that evening, urging him to set aside his obsession, to turn to prayer and the living instead of chasing shadows of the dead. But Charles only shook his head. "You do not understand," he said quietly. "He is my father. He built this house. He belongs with us." The Reverend insisted on a prayer over the household. They gathered in the parlor, Margaret clutching her rosary, Clara shivering, though the fire burned hot, and Charles standing stiff with his arms crossed. The Reverend prayed long and loud, his voice rising against the silence. As he spoke, the lamp flickered violently, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch. When he ended, there was a loud crack like a board splitting, though nothing had moved. Charles laughed bitterly. "Your words cannot drive him out," he said. "He is stronger than that." The Reverend left shaken, telling Margaret he would continue to pray for them, but his visits grew less frequent. It seemed even the church could not withstand the pull of whatever dwelled in that house. February dragged on, bleak and unrelenting. The snow piled high against the windows, and the Hartwells scarcely left the house. One night, Clara awoke to the sound of her brother's voice echoing up from the parlor. She crept down the stairs and saw him kneeling before the photograph, speaking softly, as though in conversation. She could not hear all his words, but one phrase carried clear. "Yes, Father, I will." The sight filled her with dread. She fled back upstairs and woke her mother, whispering what she had seen. Margaret held her close, tears brimming in her eyes. "I fear we are losing him, child," she said. "I fear your brother is slipping away from us." The next day, Charles was gone from the house for hours. When he returned, his boots were caked in snow, his coat damp, his hands raw and bleeding. Margaret demanded to know where he had been, but he would not answer. Only once did he mutter something that chilled her to the bone. "I had to prepare a place for him." In early March, the thaw began. The snow melted slowly, dripping from the eaves, running in streams down the roads. But with the thaw came a change in the house. The air grew colder, though the weather outside warmed. At night the lamps flickered more often, and the footsteps in the hall grew louder, heavier. Sometimes Clara swore she heard a man's breath just outside her door. Margaret began to dream not only of Jonathan, but of the photograph itself, of its frame cracking, of the figure within stepping forward out of the glass dot. And came the night of March 10th. It was late, and the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. Margaret and Clara were in their rooms when a crash echoed from the parlor below. They rushed down together and found Charles standing before the mantel, the photograph clutched in his hands. The glass had shattered again, shards glittering on. The hearth dot his eyes burned with a strange light. "He's here," Charles whispered. "He's finally here. Charles, put it down." Margaret cried, reaching for him. But he stepped back, holding the photograph close to his chest. "No, Mother, he belongs with us." "You don't understand. He wants to come home," Clara sobbed, clutching her mother's arm. Margaret pleaded with her son, begged him to let it go. But Charles turned, his face pale and rapturous, and whispered into the darkness, "Father, I am ready." At that moment, the lamp went out. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by the glow of embers in the hearth. And in that dim light, Margaret and Clara saw it, a figure standing just behind Charles. Tall, broad-shouldered, its features blurred but unmistakably human. For a heartbeat, it seemed to lean forward, as if to step into the room. Margaret screamed. Clara cried out. Charles dropped to his knees, clutching the photograph, his voice breaking. "Take me, Father. Take me with you." The figure dissolved into shadow. The lamp flickered back to life. And Charles collapsed, the photograph falling from his hands. Margaret rushed to him, but when she turned him over, his eyes were glassy, his face pale. His heart had stopped. The days that followed blurred into grief. The doctor came, said it was sudden heart failure, though Margaret and Clara knew it was something more. The Reverend spoke at the funeral, his voice trembling as he offered words of comfort. The town whispered louder than ever, their eyes darting to the Hartwell women as though they carried a curse. After Charles was buried in the family plot beside his father, Margaret could not bear to keep the photograph any longer. She took it to the barn, placed it deep in a chest, and locked it away. Yet even hidden, it seemed to weigh on the house. Clara urged her mother to leave Millbrook, to go live with relatives in Albany or New Haven, anywhere but the house. Margaret, frail and tired, shook her head. This was his house. It was Jonathan's, and now it is Charles's. I cannot abandon them. So they stayed, two women alone in a house that felt less like a home with each passing day. Clara tended. The garden, when spring came, tried to bring brightness back into their days, but the shadows never lifted fully. At night, she still heard the slow tread of boots in the hall. Sometimes, when she passed the parlor, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Years later, long after Margaret passed and Clara left Millbrook for good, neighbors still swore that the Hartwell house was not empty. Those who walked past at dusk said they saw a tall figure in the window, watching the road. And in the ruins of the old barn, when it finally collapsed decades later, townsfolk found a broken frame, its photograph faded and torn. The outlines of 3 Hartwells still visible dot in the background. Blurred but undeniable stood a 4th figure, a hidden presence, waiting, as it had always waited. And though the years rolled on, the story lingered in Millbrook, the tale of the family who smiled for the camera in 1903, unaware that someone else smiled with them.